The morning mist clung to the parade grounds at Fort Williamson like a shroud, but Captain Rebecca Turner wasn't watching the weather. She was studying the rigid formation of 260 soldiers standing at attention, their boots perfectly aligned on the painted yellow lines that had been refreshed just the week before. What caught her attention wasn't their military precision. It was the barely concealed tension radiating from every face in the formation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Captain Turner had earned her rank through a combination of tactical brilliance, unwavering integrity, and the kind of quiet leadership that inspired confidence rather than fear. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her green eyes that had seen combat in 3 deployments and learned to recognize danger in all its forms. This morning felt different, wrong. General Marcus Blackwood strode across the parade ground with the commanding presence that had defined his 30-year career. At 52, he cut an imposing figure. 6 feet 3 inches of pure military authority wrapped in a perfectly pressed uniform adorned with ribbons and medals that told the story of a decorated combat veteran. His silver hair was cut to regulation length, his jaw set in the perpetual expression of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. But Rebecca had been watching him for months, and she had begun to see patterns that troubled her deeply. Fort Williamson stretched across 15,000 acres of Virginia countryside, home to the 3rd Armored Division and nearly 20,000 military personnel and their families. The base had been Rebecca's assignment for 18 months, long enough to understand its rhythms, its politics, and its carefully maintained hierarchies. She served as the commanding officer of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 180 soldiers who had come to trust her judgment and respect her leadership. Rebecca's path to this position had neither been easy nor predictable. Born in small-town Nebraska to parents who ran a struggling family farm, she had learned early about hard work, sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. Her father, Thomas Turner, had fought the bank for 3 years to keep their land, ultimately losing the farm but never losing his dignity. Her mother, Linda, had worked double shifts at the local diner to keep food on the table while Thomas rebuilt their lives from scratch. The lessons of those difficult years had shaped her character in ways that military training could never touch. She understood that real leadership meant serving others, not serving yourself. She had learned that principles mattered more than profit, that protecting the vulnerable was more important than protecting your position. These weren't abstract concepts to her. They were the foundation of everything she believed. Her decision to join the Army had surprised no one who knew her well. Rebecca had always been drawn to challenges that seemed impossible, causes that appeared hopeless, situations where her skills could make a real difference. The military offered all of that and more, the chance to serve something larger than herself while developing the leadership skills that came naturally to her. Her first deployment to Iraq had been a baptism by fire that revealed both her tactical abilities and her moral courage. When her platoon had been pinned down by insurgent fire in Fallujah, Rebecca had led a flanking maneuver that saved 8 wounded soldiers and earned her a Bronze Star with valor. More importantly, it had earned her the unshakable loyalty of the soldiers who had witnessed her willingness to risk everything for her people. The second deployment to Afghanistan had been different, more complex, more politically charged, more dependent on the kind of cultural sensitivity and ethical decision-making that separated good officers from great ones. Rebecca had spent 14 months working with local tribal leaders to build schools and medical clinics, while simultaneously conducting counterinsurgency operations against Taliban forces. The delicate balance required constant moral navigation, and Rebecca had developed a reputation for making decisions based on what was right, rather than what was expedient. Her third deployment to Syria had been the most challenging of all. Leading a joint task force in a region where allegiances shifted daily, Rebecca had been forced to make split-second decisions that affected not just her soldiers, but entire communities caught in the crossfire of larger geopolitical conflicts. She had returned home with a silver star and a profound understanding of how institutional power could be used to protect or exploit those who had no voice of their own. Now, 18 months into her assignment at Fort Williamson, Rebecca found herself facing a different kind of challenge, one that threatened everything she had learned about leadership, integrity, and the military's core values. General Marcus Blackwood had taken command of Fort Williamson 8 months earlier, arriving with a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense leader who got results. His previous assignment had been commanding a brigade in the Middle East, where he had been credited with significant tactical successes against insurgent forces. His promotion to brigadier general and assignment to Fort Williamson had been seen as a reward for his battlefield achievements and a stepping stone to even higher command positions. But Rebecca had been watching him for months, and she had begun to see patterns that troubled her deeply. Where she saw the need for mentorship, he saw weakness that required elimination. Where she recognized the importance of building trust, he demanded unquestioning obedience. Where she understood that real strength came from lifting others up, he seemed to believe that power came from keeping others down.
The first incident that had troubled Rebecca had occurred just 6 weeks after Blackwood's arrival. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a promising young officer in her early 20s, had been conducting a training exercise when a communications failure had resulted in a minor delay in the planned timeline. The delay had been completely beyond Mitchell's control. Equipment failures were a routine part of military life that every experienced officer understood and accepted. Blackwood's response had been swift and disproportionate. He had summoned Mitchell to his office and spent 45 minutes berating her for what he characterized as a failure of leadership and attention to detail. Mitchell had emerged from the meeting visibly shaken, her usual confidence replaced by a nervousness that affected her performance for weeks afterward. When Rebecca had tried to provide encouragement and perspective, Mitchell had thanked her but remained clearly traumatized by the experience. The pattern had continued and escalated over the following months. Second Lieutenant David Park, a recent West Point graduate, had made a minor error in a logistics report that had resulted in a 1-day delay in equipment delivery. Blackwood had not only dressed him down in private, but had used Park as a negative example during a public briefing attended by dozens of officers, humiliating the young lieutenant in front of his peers and superiors. Captain Jennifer Walsh had questioned a training protocol that seemed unnecessarily dangerous, suggesting modifications that would maintain effectiveness while reducing injury risk to soldiers. Blackwood had responded by questioning Walsh's commitment to military excellence and implying that her concerns reflected a lack of understanding of what real combat required. Walsh had withdrawn her suggestions and had seemed increasingly withdrawn and demoralized in subsequent weeks. Each incident had been technically within Blackwood's authority as commanding general. Military hierarchy gave superior officers broad latitude in how they managed and disciplined their subordinates. But Rebecca recognized a pattern that went beyond legitimate leadership and into territory that served no purpose other than to satisfy Blackwood's apparent need to dominate and control. The most troubling aspect wasn't the individual incidents, it was the way they were changing the entire culture of Fort Williamson. Officers who had previously been creative, innovative, and willing to take calculated risks were becoming cautious and defensive. Junior leaders who had shown promise were second-guessing themselves constantly. The atmosphere of trust and mutual support that was essential for effective military operations was being replaced by fear and self-preservation. Rebecca had tried to address her concerns through proper channels. She had spoken with Colonel James Patterson, her immediate superior and the commander of 2nd Battalion. Patterson was a decent officer who genuinely cared about his soldiers, but he was also within 2 years of retirement and reluctant to challenge a general officer over what he characterized as different management styles. Her conversation with Patterson had been frustrating but revealing. He acknowledged that Blackwood's approach was harsh, but he pointed out that the general got results. Training scores had improved, disciplinary incidents had decreased, and efficiency ratings were at an all-time high. What Patterson didn't seem to understand was that these improvements came at the cost of the human factors that made units truly effective in combat situations. Rebecca had also tried to discuss her observations with other company commanders, hoping to build consensus around the need for a different approach. Most had acknowledged privately that they shared her concerns, but none were willing to take official action. The risks to their careers were too high, and the potential benefits were too uncertain. The isolation had been difficult for Rebecca to accept. Throughout her career, she had been part of military communities that functioned on trust, mutual support, and shared commitment to both mission success and soldier welfare. At Fort Williamson, she found herself increasingly alone in her willingness to prioritize principles over politics. Her personal life had also been affected by the stress of the situation. Rebecca had been dating Major Alex Rodriguez, a logistics officer stationed at a nearby base for almost 2 years. Their relationship had grown serious enough that they had discussed marriage and the complex career coordination that dual military couples required. But the tension at Fort Williamson had made Rebecca distracted and withdrawn, affecting her ability to maintain the emotional connection that their relationship required. Alex had noticed the change and had tried to provide support, but Rebecca found it difficult to explain the situation without sounding like she was making excuses or seeking sympathy. How could she tell him that she was losing sleep over a commanding officer whose methods were technically legal but morally questionable? How could she describe the gradual erosion of everything she believed about military leadership without sounding naive or idealistic? The night before this morning's formation, Rebecca had lain awake until nearly 3 a.m., replaying conversations and incidents from the previous months. She had thought about Lieutenant Mitchell, whose confidence had been shattered by one meeting. She had considered Captain Walsh, whose innovative thinking had been crushed by public humiliation. She had worried about the dozens of other officers and soldiers who were learning to keep their heads down rather than speaking up when they saw problems. Most of all, she had thought about her own role in allowing the situation to continue. Every day that she remained silent, every incident that she witnessed without taking action, made her complicit in a system that was failing the soldiers it was supposed to protect. The principles her parents had taught her on that Nebraska farm, the values that had guided her through 3 combat deployments, the leadership philosophy that had earned her the respect of everyone who had served under her command, all of it was being tested in ways she had never anticipated.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca's alarm had gone off at 0500, but she had already been awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if today would be different from all the others. As she had gone through her morning routine, physical training, shower, uniform preparation, breakfast, she had felt a growing sense that something was building toward a conclusion she couldn't yet see. Now, standing at the edge of the formation while General Blackwood prepared to address the assembled soldiers, Rebecca felt the weight of 18 months of accumulated tension. The morning mist was beginning to burn off, revealing a clear sky that promised a beautiful Virginia day. But the beauty of the setting couldn't disguise the underlying current of fear and resentment that had become the defining characteristic of military life at Fort Williamson. General Blackwood stepped up to the portable podium that had been positioned at the front of the formation. His posture radiated the confidence of someone who had never doubted his authority or questioned his methods. As he looked out over the 260 soldiers standing at rigid attention, Rebecca could see the satisfaction in his expression, the pleasure of someone who equated fear with respect and compliance with effectiveness. She had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would test everything she believed about leadership, courage, and the price of doing what was right. She couldn't anticipate that her response to what was about to unfold would change not just her own life, but the lives of every soldier standing in formation and the culture of the institution she had served faithfully for 8 years.
But as General Blackwood began to speak, his voice carrying across the parade ground with the authority of absolute power, Rebecca Turner prepared to discover exactly who she was and what she was willing to sacrifice for her principles. The transformation of Fort Williamson had been gradual but unmistakable. What had once been a base known for innovation and collaborative leadership was becoming something entirely different under General Blackwood's command. Rebecca first noticed it in the small details, the way junior officers now hesitated before speaking in meetings, the way conversations stopped abruptly when senior personnel entered rooms, the way creative problem-solving was being replaced by rigid adherence to protocol. Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Hayes, who commanded the base's intelligence unit, had been one of the first to experience Blackwood's evolving leadership style. Hayes was a 15-year veteran with 2 master's degrees and a reputation for analytical brilliance that had made her one of the most respected officers on base. Her intelligence assessments had been credited with preventing 3 separate terrorist attacks during her previous assignment in Germany. The incident that marked the beginning of Hayes' troubles had occurred during a routine briefing about regional security threats. Hayes had presented data suggesting that their current patrol patterns were creating predictable vulnerabilities that hostile actors might exploit. Her analysis was thorough, well-researched, and exactly the kind of proactive thinking that effective military planning required. Blackwood's response had been swift and humiliating. Rather than engaging with Hayes' analysis or asking clarifying questions, he had accused her of undermining established protocols without proper authorization. In front of a room full of subordinates, he had questioned her competence, suggested that her concerns reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of military strategy, and implied that her previous commendations might have been the result of politics rather than performance. Hayes had left the briefing visibly shaken, and her subsequent reports had become increasingly cautious and conventional. The innovative thinking that had once made her such a valuable asset was being systematically discouraged and replaced with the kind of safe, unimaginative analysis that served no purpose other than avoiding criticism. Rebecca had witnessed this transformation firsthand and had tried to provide support and encouragement to Hayes. But she quickly realized that her own position was becoming increasingly precarious as well. Blackwood had begun to pay special attention to her company's operations, finding fault with training methods that had been praised by other commanders, questioning decisions that fell well within her authority as company commander, and generally creating an atmosphere of constant scrutiny that made effective leadership nearly impossible. The first direct confrontation between Rebecca and Blackwood occurred 3 months after his arrival. Alpha Company had been conducting urban warfare training exercises in a specially constructed facility that simulated the kind of complex civilian environments where modern military operations often took place. The training was designed to teach soldiers how to distinguish between combatants and civilians, how to minimize collateral damage while achieving tactical objectives, and how to maintain ethical standards under extreme pressure. During one exercise, Private First Class Maria Gonzalez had hesitated to engage what turned out to be a hostile target because she was concerned about potential civilian casualties in the adjacent building. Her hesitation had lasted less than 3 seconds, but it had resulted in her simulated death during the training scenario. Rather than treating this as a learning opportunity about split-second decision-making in complex environments, Blackwood had used it as evidence of what he called dangerous softness in modern military training. Rebecca had defended her soldiers' thought process, explaining that Gonzalez had been applying the rules of engagement exactly as they had been trained, and that her momentary hesitation reflected the kind of ethical reasoning that prevented real-world civilian casualties. She had pointed out that 3 seconds of careful assessment in a training environment was preferable to 3 decades of guilt over innocent deaths in actual combat. Blackwood had dismissed Rebecca's explanation and had ordered immediate changes to the training protocol that emphasized speed of engagement over ethical considerations. When Rebecca had requested a private meeting to discuss her concerns about these changes, Blackwood had made it clear that he considered her objections to be evidence of the same dangerous softness he was trying to eliminate throughout the command.
The meeting had taken place in Blackwood's office, a space that reflected his personality perfectly. The walls were covered with photographs of him in various command positions, awards and commendations that documented his rise through the ranks, and military memorabilia that emphasized hierarchy and tradition over adaptation and innovation. His desk was positioned to create maximum distance between him and visitors, and his chair was elevated slightly to ensure that he literally looked down on anyone who sat across from him. During their conversation, Blackwood had made several statements that revealed his fundamental philosophy about military leadership. He believed that modern warfare required absolute obedience rather than independent thinking, that soldiers who questioned orders were inherently unreliable, and that the primary purpose of training was to eliminate hesitation and doubt rather than to develop judgment and adaptability. Rebecca had tried to present alternative perspectives based on her combat experience, pointing out that the most effective units she had served with combined tactical discipline with flexible thinking, that soldiers who understood the reasoning behind their orders were more effective than those who simply followed them blindly, and that ethical reasoning enhanced rather than undermined military effectiveness. Blackwood had listened to her arguments with visible impatience and had concluded the meeting by informing her that her perspectives reflected the kind of academic theorizing that had no place in practical military leadership. He had suggested that her success in previous assignments might have been the result of facing enemies who were less sophisticated than those they might encounter in future conflicts. The conversation had ended with Blackwood making it clear that he expected Rebecca to implement the new training protocols without further discussion, and that any additional objections would be viewed as insubordination rather than professional disagreement. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca had watched Blackwood apply similar pressure to other officers throughout the command. Major Kevin Walsh, who ran the base's logistics operations, had been criticized for maintaining safety protocols that Blackwood considered unnecessarily cautious. Captain Thomas Lee, who commanded the military police unit, had been reprimanded for investigating complaints about excessive force that Blackwood characterized as soldiers simply doing their jobs effectively. The pattern was becoming clear. Blackwood was systematically replacing collaborative leadership with authoritarian control, creative problem-solving with rigid conformity, and ethical reasoning with unquestioning obedience. Officers who resisted these changes found themselves marginalized, criticized, and eventually transferred to less desirable assignments. But the most troubling aspect of this transformation was its effect on the enlisted personnel throughout the command. Soldiers who had once felt comfortable approaching their officers with concerns or suggestions were becoming increasingly withdrawn and defensive. The atmosphere of trust that was essential for effective military operations was being replaced by fear and suspicion. Rebecca had tried to maintain morale and effectiveness within her own company, but she was fighting against larger institutional forces that seemed determined to crush the kind of leadership she believed in. Her soldiers were receiving mixed messages. Their company commander encouraged them to think independently and speak up when they saw problems, while the base commander demanded absolute compliance and discouraged any form of questioning or dissent. The stress was taking its toll on everyone involved. Rebecca had begun to notice signs of anxiety and depression among her soldiers, increased rates of disciplinary problems that seemed to stem from frustration rather than genuine misconduct, and a general decline in the enthusiasm and commitment that had previously characterized her unit. Lieutenant Mitchell, who had been Blackwood's first victim, had become a particular concern.
The young officer who had once shown such promise was now second-guessing every decision, seeking approval for routine actions that should have been within her independent authority, and generally displaying the kind of paralyzed caution that made effective leadership impossible. Rebecca had tried to rebuild Mitchell's confidence through mentoring and gradual increases in responsibility, but the damage from Blackwood's initial attack seemed to have created lasting psychological scars. Mitchell had confided that she was considering requesting a transfer or even leaving the military entirely, despite having dreamed of a military career since childhood. Similar stories were playing out throughout the base. Captain Walsh had stopped making innovative suggestions about training improvements. Lieutenant Park had withdrawn from the professional development activities that had once energized him. Dozens of other officers and enlisted personnel were showing signs of the kind of demoralization that destroyed unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Rebecca had documented these changes carefully, keeping detailed records of incidents, conversations, and observable effects on morale and performance. She had hoped to present this information to higher authorities as evidence that Blackwood's leadership style was counterproductive and potentially dangerous. But she quickly realized that the military's hierarchical structure made challenging a general officer's methods extremely difficult and potentially career-ending. Her attempts to discuss these concerns with Colonel Patterson had become increasingly frustrating. Patterson acknowledged the problems she described, but consistently characterized them as growing pains associated with a change in leadership style, rather than fundamental flaws in Blackwood's approach. He had suggested that Rebecca needed to adapt to new expectations rather than trying to preserve old methods that might no longer be appropriate. The isolation was becoming unbearable. Rebecca found herself lying awake at night, wondering whether she was imagining problems that didn't really exist, whether her own attachment to collaborative leadership was preventing her from seeing the benefits of more authoritarian approaches, whether her concerns reflected personal conflicts with Blackwood rather than genuine professional disagreements. But then she would remember Lieutenant Mitchell's shattered confidence, Captain Walsh's withdrawn demeanor, and the dozens of other examples of talented people being systematically broken down by a leadership philosophy that seemed designed to crush rather than develop human potential. She would think about her own soldiers who were caught between competing expectations and contradictory messages about what the military expected from them. The situation came to a head during a command meeting that Blackwood had called to discuss what he termed persistent problems with unit morale and discipline. Rebecca had hoped that the meeting might provide an opportunity to address the underlying causes of these problems, but Blackwood's approach had been to blame junior officers for failing to maintain proper control over their soldiers. During the meeting, Blackwood had singled out several officers for criticism, including Rebecca herself. He had suggested that their reluctance to implement his training protocols was undermining discipline throughout the command and creating the kind of permissive environment that led to reduced effectiveness and increased casualties in combat situations. Rebecca had listened to these accusations with growing anger and frustration. Everything Blackwood was describing was the opposite of what she had observed. The problems he was identifying were not the result of insufficient authority or inadequate discipline. They were the direct result of his own leadership methods that created fear, resentment, and demoralization among the very people who were supposed to be carrying out the mission. When Blackwood had finished his presentation and asked for questions or comments, Rebecca had found herself facing a moment of truth. She could remain silent, accepting his characterization of the situation and continuing to watch UD soldiers and officers be systematically destroyed. Or she could speak up, knowing that doing so would likely end her career, but might also force a conversation about leadership philosophy that the military desperately needed to have. She had chosen to speak, carefully but directly challenging Blackwood's assessment and presenting alternative explanations for the problems he had identified. She had tried to be respectful while being honest, professional while being passionate,
diplomatic while being clear about the fundamental disagreements that existed between them. Blackwood's response had been swift and decisive. He had dismissed her concerns as the kind of emotional thinking that had no place in military decision-making, characterized her observations as evidence of her own leadership failures, and made it clear that any future challenges to his authority would result in immediate disciplinary action. The meeting had ended with Rebecca understanding that she was now officially on Blackwood's list of problematic officers who needed to be dealt with. The careful balance she had tried to maintain between protecting her soldiers and preserving her career was no longer sustainable. As she walked back to her company headquarters after the meeting, Rebecca realized that she was approaching a crossroads that would define not just her military career, but her entire identity as a leader and as a person. The principles that had guided her throughout her life were coming into direct conflict with the institutional requirements of military hierarchy and obedience. The next few weeks would determine whether those principles were strong enough to survive the test they were about to face. The morning of October 15th began like any other at Fort Williamson, but there was an electric tension in the air that seemed to charge every interaction with dangerous possibility. Rebecca had awakened from another restless night, her dreams filled with fragments of confrontations and consequences that felt both inevitable and terrifying. As she prepared her uniform with the methodical precision that military life demanded, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different from all the others. The formation had been scheduled as a routine quarterly inspection, one of those mandatory military ceremonies that served multiple purposes: maintaining discipline, demonstrating unit cohesion, and providing commanders with opportunities to address their soldiers directly. General Blackwood had announced his intention to personally conduct the inspection, which meant that every detail would be scrutinized with the kind of relentless attention that turned routine events into exercises in collective anxiety. Rebecca had spent the previous evening reviewing her soldiers' equipment and uniforms, ensuring that every button was polished, every crease was sharp, and every piece of gear met the exacting standards that military inspections required. But her real concern wasn't about appearance. It was about what might happen when Blackwood had 260 soldiers at his complete disposal, standing at attention and unable to defend themselves against whatever form his leadership philosophy might take. The soldiers of Alpha Company had assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the cool October air as they conducted final equipment checks and helped each other with last-minute uniform adjustments. Rebecca moved among them, offering quiet encouragement and making minor corrections, but she could see the tension in their faces that reflected her own growing apprehension. Private First Class Gonzalez, the soldier whose hesitation during urban warfare training had drawn Blackwood's criticism months earlier, looked particularly nervous. Despite Rebecca's efforts to rebuild her confidence, Gonzalez still carried the psychological scars from that encounter.
Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, Rebecca's most experienced non-commissioned officer, had served with her through 2 deployments and understood her leadership philosophy better than anyone. He approached her as the formation was taking its final shape, his expression reflecting the same concerns that were keeping her awake at night. "Ma'am, the troops are ready," he said quietly, "but they're scared. Not of the inspection, they know they look good. They're scared of him." Rebecca nodded, understanding exactly what Torres meant. Military personnel were accustomed to demanding standards and harsh criticism when they failed to meet those standards. But Blackwood's approach went beyond legitimate military discipline and into territory that served no constructive purpose. Her soldiers weren't afraid of being corrected, they were afraid of being destroyed. "Stay close to the formation," she told Torres, "and keep your eyes open. If anything happens that seems wrong, I want you to be ready to document exactly what you see." Torres studied her face for a moment, recognizing something in her expression that made him straighten unconsciously. "Yes, ma'am, you can count on us." As the sun began to rise over the Virginia countryside, General Blackwood arrived at the parade ground with his usual entourage of staff officers and senior enlisted personnel. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing commanding, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed the absolute power that military hierarchy provided. Rebecca watched him survey the formation with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential prey. The inspection began routinely enough. Blackwood moved through the ranks with mechanical precision, examining uniforms, equipment, and military bearing with the kind of detailed attention that was both his right and his responsibility as commanding general. Most soldiers passed his scrutiny without incident, though his comments were consistently harsh and demeaning rather than constructive. But Rebecca could see him building towards something. There was an energy in his movements, a tension in his posture that suggested he was looking for more than minor uniform infractions or equipment deficiencies. He was looking for an opportunity to make a point, to demonstrate his authority in a way that would have lasting impact on everyone present. He found that opportunity when he reached Private Second Class Angelo Rodriguez, a 19-year-old soldier from Phoenix who had enlisted 6 months earlier with dreams of serving her country and earning money for college. Rodriguez was one of Rebecca's most promising new soldiers, intelligent, dedicated, and eager to prove herself worthy of the trust that military service required. But Rodriguez had made a mistake that morning. In her nervousness about the inspection, she had failed to properly secure one of the equipment straps on her field gear. It was a minor error, the kind of oversight that experienced soldiers made regularly and corrected without drama. Under normal circumstances, it would have earned her a brief correction and a reminder to pay closer attention to detail. Blackwood's response was immediate and disproportionate. He stopped directly in front of Rodriguez, his imposing frame towering over her petite stature, and began a verbal assault that seemed designed to destroy rather than educate. His voice carried across the entire formation as he berated her for what he characterized as a fundamental failure of military discipline and personal responsibility. "Soldier," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "do you think this is some kind of game? Do you think the enemy is going to give you a second chance when your equipment fails because you were too lazy or too stupid to secure it properly?" Rodriguez stood at rigid attention, her eyes fixed straight ahead, but Rebecca could see the tears beginning to form despite her efforts to maintain military bearing. The young soldier was trembling slightly, not from cold but from the psychological assault she was enduring in front of her peers and superiors. Blackwood continued his attack, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each accusation. He questioned Rodriguez's intelligence, her commitment, her fitness for military service, and her right to wear the uniform. He compared her unfavorably to soldiers who had died in combat, suggesting that her carelessness might someday cost American lives. The formation remained motionless, 259 soldiers trying to maintain their positions while witnessing the systematic humiliation of one of their own. Rebecca could feel the collective tension radiating from the assembled troops like heat from a furnace. Some soldiers looked straight ahead with carefully neutral expressions, while others showed signs of distress that reflected their helplessness in the face of institutional authority.
But Blackwood wasn't finished. As his verbal attack reached its crescendo, he stepped closer to Rodriguez, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate rather than instruct. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot against her cheek, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried across the silent formation. "Maybe you need a reminder about what military discipline really means," he said, his words heavy with threat and implication. "Maybe you need to understand that your failures have consequences that go beyond hurt feelings and wounded pride." Rebecca felt her heart rate spike as she recognized the dangerous edge that was creeping into Blackwood's voice. She had heard that tone before, during her combat deployments, in the moments before violence erupted and changed everything forever. Her combat instincts were screaming that the situation was escalating beyond verbal abuse and into territory where someone was going to get hurt. Rodriguez continued to stand at attention, but her trembling had become more pronounced and tears were now flowing freely down her cheeks. The young soldier who had enlisted with such hopes and dreams was being systematically broken in front of an audience of her peers, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that went far beyond legitimate military correction. Blackwood raised his right hand, ostensibly to point at some aspect of Rodriguez's equipment, but Rebecca could see the tension in his arm, the clenched fist, the body language that suggested he was preparing to escalate from psychological to physical abuse. Time seemed to slow as she processed what she was seeing and calculated her options. She could remain in position and hope that Blackwood would stop short of actual violence. She could call out a warning or distraction that might diffuse the situation. She could file a report after the incident and hope that higher authorities would take appropriate action. All of these options offered the possibility of preserving her career while maintaining plausible deniability about what she had or hadn't witnessed. But as Blackwood's hand moved toward Rodriguez, Rebecca realized that none of these options would protect the young soldier who was about to become the victim of an assault disguised as military discipline. In that moment, all her training, all her experience, all her principles converged on a single, unavoidable conclusion. She had to act. The decision crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. This was exactly the kind of situation that her parents had prepared her for during those difficult years on the Nebraska farm, the moment when doing what was right required risking everything you had worked to achieve. This was the test that 3 combat deployments had been preparing her for, the moment when moral courage mattered more than personal survival. Rebecca broke from her position at the edge of the formation and moved toward Blackwood with the fluid speed that 8 years of military training had ingrained in her muscle memory. Her movement was so swift and purposeful that most observers didn't initially understand what was happening. She covered the distance between her position and Rodriguez in less than 3 seconds, her focus entirely concentrated on intercepting Blackwood's hand before it could complete its intended arc. The general's attention was so focused on Rodriguez that he didn't see Rebecca approaching until she was already in motion. By the time he began to turn toward her, she had already reached him, her own hand moving to intercept him with the kind of defensive maneuver that close-quarters combat training had made instinctive. What happened next occurred so quickly that most observers would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Rebecca's hand made contact with Blackwood's wrist just as he was bringing his arm down toward Rodriguez. Her intention was to deflect his motion and create space between him and the young soldier, but Blackwood's reflexive resistance to her interference created a dynamic that neither of them had anticipated. Blackwood was a large, powerful man who had maintained his physical fitness throughout his 30-year career. But Rebecca was a combat veteran whose survival had depended on her ability to react faster and think more clearly than enemies who wanted to kill her. When Blackwood tried to push through her defensive movement, she responded with a joint manipulation technique that she had learned during her first deployment and refined through years of practice.
The sound of Blackwood's wrist breaking echoed across the parade ground like a gunshot. His scream of pain and shock shattered the morning silence and sent shockwaves through the 260 soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation. For a moment that seemed to last forever, nobody moved. The commanding general was on his knees, cradling his broken wrist against his chest, while Captain Rebecca Turner stood over him with an expression of grim determination. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. A company commander had just used physical force against a general officer in front of 260 witnesses. The carefully maintained hierarchy that governed military life had been shattered in a moment of moral courage that would change everything for everyone present. Rebecca looked down at Blackwood, who was still writhing in pain and muttering threats through gritted teeth. Then she looked at Rodriguez, whose tears had stopped flowing as she stared in shock at the woman who had risked her entire career to protect her from assault. Finally, Rebecca looked out at the formation of soldiers who were processing what they had just witnessed. Some looked at her with expressions of admiration and gratitude. Others seemed horrified by the violation of military protocol they had observed. A few appeared to be calculating how this incident might affect their own careers and relations within the command structure. But all of them understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when principle had triumphed over politics, when moral courage had overcome institutional authority, when one person's willingness to sacrifice everything had protected someone who couldn't protect herself.
The morning sun was now fully above the horizon, bathing the parade ground in golden light that seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the fundamental questions that Blackwood's broken wrist had forced them all to confront. What was the purpose of military authority? When did legitimate discipline become abusive behavior? How much should individuals sacrifice to protect institutional stability? Rebecca understood that the next few minutes would determine not just her own future, but the kind of organization the military was going to be. The silence had been broken, the line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the careful balance of complicity and willful ignorance that had allowed toxic leadership to flourish unchallenged. As General Blackwood was helped to his feet by two of his staff officers, his face contorted with pain and rage, Rebecca Turner prepared to face the consequences of 5 seconds that had changed everything. The seconds immediately following Blackwood's collapse stretched like hours in Rebecca's perception. The parade ground had become a frozen tableau of shock and disbelief. 260 soldiers processing an event that challenged everything they understood about military hierarchy and acceptable behavior. The only sounds were Blackwood's labored breathing and the distant rumble of vehicles on the base's main thoroughfare. Life continuing normally, while their small corner of the military world had been turned upside down. Major Timothy Crawford, Blackwood's chief of staff, was the first to break from the collective paralysis. A career officer with 22 years of service, Crawford had built his reputation on crisis management and political damage control. His mind was already racing through protocols, regulations, and procedures that might help contain what could become a career-ending disaster for everyone involved.
"Formation dismissed," Crawford announced, his voice carrying across the parade ground with an authority that seemed borrowed from his unconscious general. "Return to your units immediately and await further instructions. No one discusses what happened here until official statements are issued." The soldiers began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of speculation and concern that would spread throughout Fort Williamson within hours. Some lingered at the edges of the formation, clearly hoping to witness whatever would happen next between Rebecca and the command structure that she had just challenged so dramatically. Sergeant First Class Torres approached Rebecca cautiously, his expression mixing concern for her welfare with professional calculation about his own position. As her senior NCO, he was uniquely positioned to either support her version of events or distance himself from actions that might be characterized as assault on a superior officer. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "medical personnel are en route. Colonel Patterson has been notified and is requesting your immediate presence at battalion headquarters." Rebecca nodded, understanding that the administrative machinery of military justice was already beginning to turn. Within minutes, her actions would be documented, analyzed, and evaluated by officers whose careers depended on their ability to navigate complex political situations without making waves that might affect their own advancement prospects. Dr. Captain Lisa Zhang, the base's chief medical officer, arrived with 2 medics and immediately began assessing Blackwood's injury. Zhang was a competent physician who had served in combat zones and understood the difference between accidents and intentional violence. Her examination would likely be crucial in determining whether Rebecca faced administrative discipline or criminal charges. As Zhang worked to stabilize Blackwood's wrist and prepare him for transport to the base medical facility, she caught Rebecca's eye with an expression that was professionally neutral but somehow reassuring. Zhang had been present during several meetings where Blackwood's leadership style had been discussed, and Rebecca hoped that her medical expertise might provide an objective perspective on the incident. "The fracture appears to be clean," Zhang announced to no one in particular, her words carefully chosen to avoid implications about how the injury had occurred. "General Blackwood will need immediate surgical intervention to ensure proper healing and full restoration of function." Blackwood himself had recovered enough from the initial shock and pain to begin asserting his authority despite his compromised physical condition. His face was pale with pain and flushed with anger as he struggled to his feet with assistance from Crawford and the medics.
"Captain Turner," he said through gritted teeth, his voice carrying a mixture of rage and disbelief, "you have just ended your military career and possibly earned yourself a lengthy prison sentence. I hope whatever misguided sense of heroism motivated your actions was worth destroying your life." Rebecca met his gaze directly, her own voice steady, despite the adrenaline that was still coursing through her system. "General Blackwood, I acted to prevent what I perceived as an imminent assault on one of my soldiers. I take full responsibility for my actions and will cooperate completely with any investigation." The formal language couldn't disguise the fundamental challenge that her response represented. Rebecca was not apologizing, not expressing regret, not acknowledging any wrongdoing on her part. She was stating clearly that she believed her actions were justified and that she was prepared to defend them through whatever legal and administrative processes might follow. Crawford stepped forward, clearly hoping to defuse the confrontation before it escalated further. "General, sir, I think it would be best to focus on getting you proper medical attention. These other matters can be addressed through appropriate channels once we have a clearer understanding of what occurred." Blackwood allowed himself to be guided toward the waiting medical vehicle, but his parting words to Rebecca carried the weight of absolute authority challenged and dignity wounded. "This isn't over, Captain. Not by a long shot." As the medical team departed with Blackwood, Rebecca found herself alone on the parade ground, except for Torres and 2 military police officers who had arrived to secure the scene. The MPs, Staff Sergeant Kevin Johnson and Specialist Amy Chen, approached her with the careful professionalism that military law enforcement applied to situations involving senior personnel.
"Ma'am," Johnson said respectfully, "we need to ask you to accompany us to battalion headquarters for an initial statement. You're not under arrest, but this is a formal investigation, and you should understand that anything you say will be documented and could be used in subsequent proceedings." Rebecca nodded, understanding that the legal machinery of military justice was now in motion and would continue regardless of her personal feelings about the situation. As she walked with the MPs toward the administrative building, she caught sight of Private Rodriguez, who was still standing where the incident had occurred, tears streaming down her face. "Rodriguez!" Rebecca called out, causing the young soldier to look up with an expression of gratitude mixed with guilt. "This wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. Do you understand me?" Rodriguez nodded wordlessly, but Rebecca could see the psychological burden that the young soldier was already beginning to carry. In military culture, when superior officers clashed, subordinates often blamed themselves for creating the conditions that led to conflict. Rebecca knew that Rodriguez would need counseling and support to prevent her from carrying undeserved guilt about the incident. The walk to battalion headquarters felt surreal. Fort Williamson looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Same buildings, same vehicles, same soldiers going about their duties. But Rebecca knew that everything had fundamentally changed. Word of the incident would spread throughout the base within hours, creating ripples of speculation, concern, and political calculation that would affect every aspect of military life at the installation. Colonel Patterson was waiting in his office, his expression reflecting the complex mixture of emotions that career military officers experienced when confronted with situations that defied easy categorization. Patterson was a decent man who genuinely cared about his soldiers, but he was also a political realist who understood that his own career could be affected by how he handled the current crisis. "Rebecca," he said as she entered his office, using her first name in a way that suggested he was trying to maintain some personal connection despite the formal circumstances. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there, and I need you to think very carefully about how you characterize your actions." The warning was clear. Patterson was offering her an opportunity to frame the incident in a way that might minimize the consequences she faced. She could describe her actions as accidental, claim that she had intended only to restrain Blackwood rather than injure him, express regret for the outcome while maintaining that her intentions were honorable. But Rebecca had already decided that her best defense was complete honesty about what had occurred and why she had felt compelled to act. Any attempt to minimize or mischaracterize her actions would undermine her credibility and suggest that she wasn't confident in the ethical foundation of her decisions. "Sir, General Blackwood was conducting a verbal assault on Private Rodriguez that escalated to the point where I believed he was about to strike her. His body language, the tone of his voice, and his positioning relative to the soldier all indicated that he was preparing to use physical violence as part of what he characterized as military discipline." Patterson listened carefully, making notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. His experience with military investigations told him that Rebecca's straightforward account would either provide strong justification for her actions or make her vulnerable to charges of assault on a superior officer, depending on whether witnesses corroborated her interpretation of Blackwood's intentions. "Rebecca, you understand the seriousness of what you're alleging. You're suggesting that a general officer was about to commit assault in front of 260 witnesses. That's an extraordinary claim that will require extraordinary evidence to support." Rebecca met his gaze directly. "Sir, I understand the implications of my allegations. I also understand the implications of remaining silent when I witness behavior that violates both military regulations and basic human decency. I made a split-second decision based on my assessment of an immediate threat to one of my soldiers." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes as Patterson methodically documented Rebecca's account of the incident and her explanation of the factors that had influenced her decision to intervene. His questions were professional but pointed, clearly designed to identify potential weaknesses in her version of events that investigating officers might exploit. As the interview concluded, Patterson leaned back in his chair with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many good officers destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. "Rebecca, I'm going to be honest with you. Even if everything you're saying is completely accurate, you've put yourself in an extremely difficult position. The military justice system doesn't look favorably on subordinates who use physical force against superior officers, regardless of the circumstances."
Rebecca nodded, understanding that Patterson was trying to prepare her for the challenges she would face in the days and weeks ahead. But she also detected something else in his tone, a suggestion that he might not be entirely unsympathetic to her position, despite his concerns about the proper channels and procedures that should have been followed. "Sir, if I had tried to address General Blackwood's behavior through normal channels, Private Rodriguez would have been assaulted while I was filing paperwork. Sometimes the right thing to do and the procedure for doing it don't align perfectly." Patterson's slight nod suggested that he understood her reasoning, even if he couldn't officially endorse it. As Rebecca prepared to leave his office, he offered one final piece of advice that revealed his own conflicted feelings about the situation. "Captain Turner, you're going to face a formal investigation that could result in court-martial proceedings. I strongly recommend that you retain legal counsel immediately and that you prepare yourself for a process that could last several months. But I also want you to know that there are officers on this base who respect what you tried to do, even if they question how you went about it." As Rebecca walked across the base toward her quarters, she felt the weight of the next few days settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. The immediate crisis had passed, but the real test was just beginning. Within hours, investigators would arrive to interview witnesses, collect evidence, and determine whether her actions constituted justified intervention or criminal assault. Her phone was already buzzing with messages from other officers who had heard about the incident and wanted to express support, concern, or simple curiosity about what had really happened. Major Rodriguez from Logistics wanted to know if she needed anything. Captain Walsh from the military police had offered to help with legal referrals. Lieutenant Mitchell, whose own experience with Blackwood's methods had given her a unique insight into the situation, had sent a text message that simply said, "Thank you." But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Private Rodriguez had somehow obtained her personal number and had sent a message that brought tears to her eyes. "Ma'am, I don't know what's going to happen to you, but I wanted you to know that you saved me today. I won't forget that, ever." That evening, as Rebecca sat in her quarters reviewing the events of the day and preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead, she realized that regardless of what happened to her career, her freedom, or her future, she had accomplished something that couldn't be taken away by courts or commanders. She had protected someone who couldn't protect herself, demonstrated that moral courage could triumph over institutional authority, and proven that the principles her parents had taught her on Nebraska farm were strong enough to withstand the ultimate test. The investigation would proceed according to military regulations and legal procedures. Witnesses would be interviewed, evidence would be collected, and decisions would be made by officers whose primary concern was maintaining order and discipline within the command structure. But Rebecca had already won the only victory that truly mattered: the knowledge that when faced with a choice between doing what was safe and doing what was right, she had chosen correctly. The consequences would reveal themselves in the days ahead, but the decision itself was something she would never regret. The investigation began 48 hours after the incident with the arrival of Colonel Margaret Stone from the Army Criminal Investigation Command at Fort Belvoir. Stoney was a 24-year veteran with a reputation for methodical thoroughness and political independence that made her both respected and feared throughout the military legal community. Her assignment to the case signaled that higher authorities were taking the situation seriously and wanted an investigation that couldn't be dismissed as biased or incomplete.
Rebecca first encountered Stone in the sterile environment of Conference Room C at the base legal offices, a space designed for formal proceedings rather than comfortable conversation. Stone was a compact woman in her late 40s with graying hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that came from years of separating truth from carefully constructed narratives. Her approach was professional but not unsympathetic, suggesting that she understood the human complexities that military regulations often failed to address adequately. "Captain Turner," Stone began, activating a digital recorder with practiced efficiency, "I want to be clear about the scope and purpose of this investigation. We're examining not just the specific incident of October 15th, but the broader circumstances that led to that confrontation. My job is to determine what really happened and why, not to protect reputations or preserve institutional relationships." The preliminary interviews had already revealed inconsistencies and contradictions that suggested the incident was more complex than initial reports had indicated. Some witnesses described Rebecca's intervention as an unprovoked attack on a superior officer conducting legitimate military discipline. Others characterized it as necessary protection of a soldier who was about to be assaulted by an officer whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and abusive. But Stone had also uncovered information that changed the entire context of the investigation. Her systematic review of incident reports, transfer requests, and medical records from the previous 8 months had revealed patterns of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of leadership at Fort Williamson under General Blackwood's command. The breakthrough came during Stone's interview with Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, a 15-year veteran who served in the base's personnel office and had access to records that most soldiers never saw. Williams had been reluctant to speak initially, concerned about potential retaliation for criticizing a general officer. But Stone's reputation for protecting witnesses and her obvious commitment to uncovering the truth had gradually convinced him to share information he had been carrying for months. "Ma'am," Williams told Stone during their private conversation, "what happened to Private Rodriguez wasn't isolated. We've had 17 formal requests for transfers out of units under General Blackwood's direct command in the past 6 months. That's more than triple the normal rate, and most of the soldiers cite incompatible leadership styles as their reason for wanting to leave." Stone made detailed notes as Williams continued his account. The personnel records revealed a pattern of soldiers seeking escape from conditions they found intolerable, but were unable to describe in official terminology that wouldn't end their careers. Military culture discouraged criticism of superior officers, so soldiers had learned to use euphemistic language that protected them from charges of insubordination while documenting their desperation to escape toxic environments. But more significantly, Williams had documented 3 separate incidents where soldiers had been treated for injuries that occurred during what were officially characterized as training exercises, but which medical personnel had privately questioned. 2 soldiers had suffered concussions during hand-to-hand combat training that witnesses described as unnecessarily violent. A third had sustained a dislocated shoulder during what was supposed to be a demonstration of proper restraint techniques. The medical staff started asking questions, Williams explained, but General Blackwood shut down those inquiries by claiming they were interfering with legitimate training operations. Dr. Zhang tried to pursue it through proper channels, but she was told that combat readiness required realistic training that might occasionally result in minor injuries. Stone's investigation expanded to include interviews with medical personnel, training officers, and soldiers throughout the base who had observed or experienced Blackwood's leadership methods. Each conversation added new details to a picture of systematic abuse disguised as military discipline, institutional failures that had allowed dangerous behavior to continue unchecked, and a culture of fear that prevented victims from seeking help through official channels. Dr. Zhang proved to be a particularly valuable witness. As chief medical officer, she had professional obligations that transcended military hierarchy, and her medical training gave her unique insight into the difference between legitimate training injuries and evidence of abuse. Her testimony revealed that she had been documenting concerning patterns for months, but had been unable to take action because military regulations required her to report through chains of command that included the very officer whose behavior she was questioning. I've treated 7 soldiers in the past 4 months for what I would characterize as trauma-related symptoms: anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, and stress-related physical ailments that were clearly connected to their military service, but which they were reluctant to discuss in detail. When I tried to ask about the sources of their stress, they consistently indicated that speaking openly might jeopardize their careers. The medical records that Zhang provided to Stone painted a disturbing picture of an institution that was systematically damaging the physical and psychological health of the people it was supposed to protect. The evidence went far beyond the single incident involving Private Rodriguez and suggested that Rebecca's intervention had prevented one assault while exposing a pattern of abuse that had been hidden from higher authorities.
But Stone's most significant discovery came during her interview with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the intelligence officer whose analytical brilliance had been systematically undermined by Blackwood's leadership methods. Hayes had initially been reluctant to participate in the investigation, concerned that any criticism of her commanding officer might be viewed as an attempt to excuse her own declining performance evaluations. However, Stone's approach gradually convinced Hayes that the investigation offered an opportunity to address institutional problems that extended far beyond personal grievances or individual conflicts. Hayes had been documenting incidents and patterns for months, maintaining detailed records that she had hoped to present to higher authorities if she could find appropriate channels and sufficient courage. Colonel Stone, Hayes said during their extensive interview, what Captain Turner did was prevent one specific assault, but General Blackwood's behavior represents a systematic pattern of abuse that affects everyone under his command. I've documented 43 separate incidents over 8 months where his actions violated both military regulations and basic standards of human decency. Hayes provided Stone with a comprehensive dossier that included dates, witnesses, and detailed descriptions of incidents that revealed the full scope of Blackwood's misconduct. The documentation was methodical and professional, the work of an intelligence officer who understood the importance of evidence and corroboration in building cases that could withstand scrutiny. The incidents Hayes had documented included financial exploitation of subordinate officers, sexual harassment disguised as military mentoring, retaliation against soldiers who reported safety concerns, and the systematic destruction of careers belonging to officers who challenged his authority or methods. The pattern revealed a commanding officer who had used his position to create what amounted to a personal fiefdom, where his authority was absolute and accountability was non-existent. But perhaps most significantly, Hayes had uncovered evidence that Blackwood's behavior had been enabled by failures at multiple levels of the military hierarchy. Her investigation revealed that complaints about his methods had been filed with the Inspector General's office at division headquarters, but had been dismissed without proper investigation due to what appeared to be political considerations related to Blackwood's family connections and career trajectory. General Blackwood's father-in-law is Congressman William Bradford, who serves on the House Armed Services Committee, Hayes explained to Stone. That relationship has provided him with protection from consequences that would have ended most officers' careers. Complaints about his behavior were consistently dismissed as personality conflicts or political vendettas rather than legitimate concerns about leadership and conduct. The revelation of political interference in military justice proceedings added a new dimension to Stone's investigation. What had begun as an examination of one officer's response to an immediate threat was evolving into a comprehensive review of institutional failures, political corruption, and systematic abuse that reached into the highest levels of military and civilian authority. Stone expanded her investigation to include interviews with officers at division and corps headquarters who had knowledge of previous complaints about Blackwood's conduct. Her conversations revealed a pattern of institutional protection that had allowed dangerous behavior to continue despite clear evidence that it was harming military readiness and soldier welfare. The political implications became clearer during Stone's interview with Brigadier General Robert Chen, who served as deputy commander at division headquarters and had been responsible for reviewing several of the earlier complaints about Blackwood's methods. Chen was initially defensive about his handling of those complaints, but Stone's persistence and evidence eventually convinced him to provide a more complete account of the political pressures that had influenced his decisions.
Colonel Stone, Chen admitted during their conversation, I received direct guidance from the commanding general that complaints about General Blackwood should be handled with special sensitivity due to his political connections and the potential impact on relationships with congressional leadership. I was told that unless there was clear evidence of criminal behavior, administrative solutions were preferable to formal investigations that might attract media attention. The admission confirmed Hayes' analysis and revealed that Blackwood's misconduct had been systematically covered up by officers more concerned with political considerations than with protecting soldiers under their command. The investigation was uncovering not just individual failings, but institutional corruption that had created conditions where abuse could flourish without consequences. Meanwhile, Rebecca found herself at the center of a legal and political storm that was growing more complex each day. The initial charges against her had been relatively straightforward: assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, and failure to follow proper procedures for reporting misconduct. But as Stone's investigation revealed the broader context of institutional failures and systematic abuse, Rebecca's actions were increasingly being viewed as justified intervention rather than criminal assault. The legal proceedings took an unexpected turn when Stone's investigation uncovered video evidence from security cameras that had captured portions of the October 15th incident. The footage, which had initially been considered irrelevant because it didn't show the actual moment of contact between Rebecca and Blackwood, provided crucial context that supported Rebecca's account of the events leading up to her intervention. The video clearly showed Blackwood's increasingly aggressive behavior toward Private Rodriguez, his invasion of her personal space, and his threatening gestures that preceded Rebecca's intervention. Most significantly, the audio track captured Blackwood's verbal threats and the menacing tone that had convinced Rebecca that Rodriguez was in immediate physical danger. "The evidence is clear," Stone told Rebecca during one of their final interviews. "General Blackwood was engaging in behavior that violated multiple military regulations regarding the treatment of subordinate personnel. Your intervention prevented what medical experts agree would have constituted assault, and your actions were consistent with your training and obligations as an officer responsible for protecting soldiers under your command." The vindication was overwhelming, but Rebecca understood that legal justification was only part of the challenge she faced. The military was an institution that valued order and hierarchy above individual heroism, and her actions had disrupted both in ways that some officers would never forgive, regardless of their legal or moral justification. But Stone's investigation had also revealed something unexpected: the extent to which Rebecca's actions had inspired other soldiers to find their own courage in challenging toxic leadership. The investigation had given dozens of victims an opportunity to speak truthfully about their experiences, and their collective testimony was creating momentum for institutional changes that would extend far beyond Williamson. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Stone discovered that General Blackwood himself had been under investigation by federal authorities for financial irregularities related to defense contracting. His aggressive leadership style and political protection had been part of a broader pattern of corruption that included kickbacks from contractors, misuse of government resources, and abuse of authority for personal benefit. The revelation transformed Rebecca's case from a simple assault charge into a whistleblower situation where her actions had inadvertently exposed systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. The political and legal implications were staggering, and Rebecca found herself at the center of a story that would ultimately reshape military culture and accountability throughout the armed forces. 6 months after the incident that had shattered the morning calm at Fort Williamson, Rebecca Turner stood in the Pentagon briefing room addressing a gathering of senior military leaders whose ranks included generals, admirals, and civilian defense officials. The woman who had once been facing court-martial for assault on a superior officer was now being consulted as an expert on ethical leadership and institutional reform. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. General Blackwood's removal from command had been followed by a systematic overhaul of leadership structures, training protocols, and accountability mechanisms throughout the Army. What had begun as one captain's split-second decision to protect a vulnerable soldier had evolved into the most significant military culture reform initiative in decades. Rebecca's new role as Director of Ethical Leadership Development had been created specifically to institutionalize the lessons learned from what military historians were already calling the Williamson Incident. Her mandate was broad and unprecedented: to develop training programs, create reporting mechanisms, and establish cultural changes that would prevent toxic leadership from taking root in military organizations. The Pentagon briefing she was delivering focused on preliminary results from pilot programs that had been implemented at 12 military installations across the country. The data was encouraging, but revealed the depth of problems that had been festering throughout the military hierarchy for years. The anonymous reporting system we've implemented has generated over 3,400 complaints about toxic leadership in its first 90 days of operation, Rebecca told the assembled officials. More significantly, follow-up investigations have substantiated misconduct allegations in 78% of cases, suggesting that soldiers now feel empowered to report problems that were previously hidden due to fear of retaliation. Secretary of Defense Patricia Morrison, a former Marine officer who had personally championed the reform initiative, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Captain Turner, what patterns are you seeing in terms of the types of misconduct being reported, and how do they compare to the behaviors documented in the Williamson investigation?" Rebecca referred to her prepared materials,
which represented hundreds of hours of analysis by teams of social scientists, military lawyers, and behavioral specialists who had been tasked with understanding the systemic nature of the problems they were trying to solve. Ma'am, we're seeing consistent patterns across all branches of service. Financial exploitation of subordinates, sexual harassment disguised as mentoring, retaliation against soldiers who report safety concerns, and the systematic destruction of careers belonging to personnel who challenge authority. The Blackwood case wasn't an isolated incident. It was representative of institutional failures that affected thousands of service members. The briefing continued for 2 hours as Rebecca detailed the comprehensive reform program that had emerged from Colonel Stone's investigation. New training requirements for all officers focused on ethical decision-making under pressure. Revised reporting procedures created multiple pathways for soldiers to raise concerns without fear of career destruction. Independent oversight mechanisms provided protection for whistleblowers and ensured that political considerations couldn't derail legitimate investigations. But the most significant changes were cultural rather than procedural. The military was beginning to embrace a different understanding of leadership that emphasized moral courage alongside tactical competence, that valued protection of subordinates as highly as mission accomplishment, that recognized ethical reasoning as a combat multiplier rather than a weakness to be eliminated. The transformation at Fort Williamson itself had been dramatic and immediate. General Blackwood's replacement, Brigadier General Maria Vasquez, had arrived with a mandate to rebuild trust and implement the new leadership standards that were being developed throughout the Army. Vasquez was a combat veteran with a reputation for collaborative leadership and genuine concern for soldier welfare, and her approach created an immediate contrast with her predecessor's methods. Private Rodriguez, whose victimization had triggered the entire sequence of events, had thrived under the new leadership environment. No longer paralyzed by fear and self-doubt, she had become one of the most promising soldiers in her unit, earning early promotion to specialist and acceptance into a competitive leadership development program. Her transformation from victim to empowered advocate had become a symbol of the broader cultural changes taking place throughout the military. "I used to be afraid to speak up about anything," Rodriguez told Rebecca during one of their periodic conversations. "Now I feel like the Army actually wants to hear what soldiers think and that our concerns will be taken seriously rather than used against us." The ripple effects extended far beyond Fort Williamson and even beyond the military itself. Corporate leadership programs had begun incorporating case studies from the Williamson investigation, teaching business executives about the costs of toxic management and the importance of ethical decision-making in organizational culture. Universities offered courses on moral courage that used Rebecca's experience as a framework for understanding how individuals could catalyze institutional change. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on other military personnel who had found inspiration in Rebecca's example. Colonel Stone's investigation had documented dozens of instances where soldiers and officers had been motivated by the Williamson incident to report misconduct, challenge unethical orders, or protect vulnerable colleagues despite potential career consequences. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, whose intelligence analysis had been crucial in exposing the full scope of Blackwood's misconduct, had been promoted to full colonel and assigned to lead the Army's new Institutional Integrity Office. Her analytical skills and personal experience with toxic leadership made her uniquely qualified to identify and address systemic problems before they could cause widespread damage. The Williamson incident taught us that individual moral courage can transform institutions, but it also taught us that institutional change requires systematic approaches that go beyond heroic individual actions. We needed to create systems that made moral courage easier and safer for everyone. The legal proceedings against General Blackwood had concluded with his court-martial conviction on charges including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer,
financial misconduct, and obstruction of justice. His sentence included dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 18 months in military prison. But more significantly, his case had established legal precedents that strengthened protections for soldiers who reported misconduct and clarified the obligations of officers to protect subordinates from abuse.
The political implications had been equally significant. Congressman Bradford's attempts to influence military justice proceedings had triggered a congressional ethics investigation that ultimately led to his resignation from office. The separation of military and civilian authority had been strengthened through new regulations that prevented political interference with legal proceedings and created independent oversight of senior officer assignments. Rebecca's personal journey had been as transformative as the institutional changes her actions had catalyzed. The captain who had once struggled with isolation and moral compromise within a toxic system had become a recognized expert on ethical leadership whose insights were sought by organizations throughout the government and private sector. Her relationship with Major Rodriguez had deepened and evolved as they had navigated the challenges and opportunities created by her sudden prominence in military reform efforts. They had married in a ceremony attended by many of the soldiers whose lives had been changed by the events at Fort Williamson, including Private Rodriguez, who served as one of Rebecca's honor guards. The personal cost of her decision had been significant but manageable. 18 months of legal uncertainty, congressional testimony, media attention, and professional scrutiny had taken their toll on her emotional and physical health. But the support she had received from fellow service members, the knowledge that her actions had protected vulnerable soldiers, and the opportunity to create lasting institutional change had provided compensation that no court could have ordered. Her parents had attended every hearing and proceeding, their presence serving as a constant reminder of the values that had shaped her character and guided her through the most difficult period of her life. Thomas Turner, now in his 70s, but still carrying himself with the dignity that had survived the loss of the family farm, had told reporters that he was proud of his daughter for choosing principle over convenience, justice over safety. "We raised Rebecca to believe that there are moments in life when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right," he had said during one interview. "She made that choice, and we couldn't be more proud of the woman she's become and the changes she's helped create." The training programs Rebecca had developed were being implemented throughout the military with measurable results. Exit surveys showed dramatic improvements in soldier satisfaction with leadership quality. Retention rates had increased as service members developed greater confidence that their concerns would be addressed appropriately. Most importantly, incident reports showed significant reductions in the kinds of misconduct that had once flourished under toxic leadership. But Rebecca understood that cultural change was a long-term process that required constant vigilance and continued commitment from leaders at every level. The systems and procedures they had created were only as effective as the people who implemented them, and the temptation to revert to authoritarian approaches would always exist in institutions designed around hierarchy and obedience. The most rewarding aspect of her new role was the opportunity to mentor young officers who were entering military service with different expectations and higher standards than previous generations. These new leaders had been shaped by the reforms that emerged from the Williamson incident, and they represented the future of an institution that was learning to balance mission effectiveness with human dignity. During a recent leadership seminar at West Point, Rebecca had addressed 200 future officers about the relationship between moral courage and military effectiveness. Her message had been simple but profound: that protecting those who couldn't protect themselves wasn't a distraction from military duties, but the very essence of what military service was supposed to accomplish. "Leadership isn't about having power over people," she had told the cadets. It's about having the wisdom to use that power responsibly, the courage to protect those who can't protect themselves, and the strength to do what's right even when it costs you everything you've worked to achieve. The applause that followed had been sustained and heartfelt, but Rebecca knew that the real test would come when these future leaders faced their own moral crises. Would they remember her words when their careers were on the line? Would they choose principle over politics when the stakes were highest? The institutional changes that had emerged from her actions provided reasons for optimism. The military was becoming an organization that rewarded moral courage rather than punishing it, that valued ethical reasoning alongside tactical competence, that understood protection of human dignity as essential to mission effectiveness. But Rebecca understood that the work was far from finished. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities for both progress and regression, new tests of the cultural changes that had been implemented with such hope and determination. As she prepared for another day of training sessions, policy development, and institutional consultation, Rebecca Turner reflected on the journey that had brought her from a struggling farm in Nebraska to the Pentagon's corridors of power. The scared captain who had broken a general's wrist to protect a vulnerable soldier had become a recognized leader in one of the most significant military reform efforts in American history.
The transformation had been both personal and institutional, both painful and rewarding, both ending and beginning. The silence had been broken, the culture had been changed, and the legacy would endure for generations of service members who would benefit from systems designed to protect rather than exploit, to empower rather than diminish, to serve justice rather than merely preserving order. 10 years had passed since that October morning when Captain Rebecca Turner's split-second decision changed the trajectory of military culture across America. Now Brigadier General Rebecca Turner Rodriguez stood in the auditorium at the newly established National Center for Military Ethics at Fort Leavenworth, preparing to deliver the keynote address to an international gathering of military leaders from 37 countries who had come to study the American military's transformation in ethical leadership. The center itself represented the culmination of a decade-long effort to institutionalize the lessons learned from what historians now called the Williamson Transformation. Built on the site where General Blackwood had once conducted his reign of terror, the facility served as both a practical training ground for ethical leadership and a symbolic reminder of how individual courage could reshape institutional culture. Rebecca's audience included generals, admirals, defense ministers, and civilian officials from nations across 6 continents, all seeking to understand how the American military had achieved measurable improvements in retention, effectiveness, and moral standards while maintaining combat readiness and mission capability. The transformation had become a model for military reform worldwide. But Rebecca knew that the real measure of success wasn't in the awards and recognition. It was in the lives of individual service members who now served in an environment that valued their dignity alongside their dedication. 10 years ago, Rebecca began, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium with the authority that came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. I made a decision that lasted 5 seconds, but created changes that will endure for generations. Today, I want to share not just what happened in those 5 seconds, but what we've learned in the decades since about the relationship between individual moral courage and institutional transformation. In the front row sat Angela Rodriguez Chen, now Colonel Rodriguez Chen, commanding officer of the 3rd Infantry Division's Ethics Training Battalion. The former private who had been terrorized by General Blackwood had become one of the military's most respected leaders in character development. Her personal journey from victim to advocate, serving as inspiration for thousands of soldiers who had faced similar challenges. Rodriguez Chen's transformation exemplified the broader cultural shift that had occurred throughout the military.
She had not only survived her traumatic experience, but had used it as motivation to ensure that future generations of soldiers would never face the kind of systematic abuse that had once been tolerated as normal leadership behavior. Her battalion had trained over 50,000 military personnel in ethical decision-making, bystander intervention, and moral courage under pressure. The young soldiers whose protection triggered this entire transformation is now a colonel who has trained tens of thousands of military leaders, Rebecca continued, gesturing toward Rodriguez Chen. Her journey from victim to advocate represents the human dimension of institutional change, the recognition that protecting individual dignity isn't separate from mission effectiveness but essential to it. The audience included Major General Sandra Hayes, now serving as the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, responsible for talent management and leadership development across the entire service. Hayes had used her intelligence analysis expertise to create data-driven approaches to identifying and addressing toxic leadership before it could cause widespread damage. Her systems had prevented hundreds of potential Williamson incidents through early intervention and targeted support. The statistical evidence of transformation was impressive by any measure. Military suicide rates had decreased by 43% over the decade following the Williamson incident, with the most dramatic improvements occurring in units where the new ethical leadership training had been most thoroughly implemented. Sexual harassment and assault rates had dropped by 67%, while reporting rates had increased by 340%, indicating that soldiers felt safer coming forward with concerns and more confident that their reports would be handled appropriately. Retention rates had improved across all ranks and specialties, with exit interviews consistently identifying improved leadership quality as the primary factor in soldiers' decisions to continue their military careers. Combat effectiveness metrics had improved rather than declined, supporting the argument that ethical leadership enhanced rather than undermined military capability. But the most significant changes were qualitative rather than quantitative. The military had become an institution that attracted and developed leaders who understood that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them, that genuine authority was earned through service rather than imposed through fear, that lasting effectiveness required building people up rather than tearing them down.
The lesson of the Williamson incident isn't that breaking your superior's wrist is the solution to toxic leadership, she explained to scattered laughter from the audience. The lesson is that someone, somewhere, at some point, has to be willing to say this is wrong and act on that conviction regardless of personal cost. The goal of institutional reform is to make those moments of moral courage less necessary by creating environments where they're less likely to be required. Following her keynote address, Rebecca participated in a panel discussion with other leaders who had played crucial roles in the military's transformation. The conversation revealed the complexity and interconnectedness of the changes that had occurred over the past decade, showing how individual courage had catalyzed institutional reforms that had, in turn, created conditions for more widespread cultural change. Dr. Captain Lisa Zhang, now Surgeon General of the Army, discussed the medical community's role in identifying and addressing the health impacts of toxic leadership. Her research had documented the physiological costs of abusive command climates and had provided medical justification for leadership reforms that some officials had initially viewed as politically motivated rather than operationally necessary. We now understand that toxic leadership creates measurable health impacts that affect military readiness just as surely as combat injuries or equipment failures, Zhang explained. The reforms that began with the Williamson incident have improved not just the moral climate of military service, but the physical and mental health of service members throughout the armed forces. Colonel Margaret Stone, now director of the Army Criminal Investigation Command, had spent the decades since the Williamson investigation developing new approaches to identifying and addressing institutional misconduct. Her methods had been adopted throughout the Department of Defense and had significantly improved the military's ability to detect and prevent systematic abuse before it could cause widespread damage. The Williamson investigation taught us that individual incidents of misconduct are often symptoms of larger institutional failures, Stone told the international audience. We've learned to look beyond individual bad actors to examine the systems and cultures that enable misconduct to flourish. Prevention is always more effective than prosecution. The panel discussion continued with contributions from General Maria Vasquez, who had replaced General Blackwood at Fort Williamson and had overseen the base's transformation into a model of ethical leadership. Her experience had provided insights into the practical challenges of implementing cultural change in established military organizations and had informed best practices that were being applied throughout the armed forces. Change is possible, Vasquez emphasized, but it requires sustained commitment from leaders at every level and recognition that cultural transformation is a long-term process rather than a quick fix. The soldiers and officers who serve today deserve institutions that are worthy of their sacrifice and dedication. The day concluded with a ceremony at the memorial wall that had been constructed at the center to honor service members who had lost their lives to suicide, many of whom had been victims of toxic leadership climates that the military was now committed to preventing. The wall included the names of soldiers from Fort Williamson and hundreds of other installations whose deaths had motivated the comprehensive reforms that followed the Williamson incident. Rebecca stood before the memorial with Rodriguez Chen and other leaders who had shaped the transformation, reading names that represented both tragedy and motivation for the work that still lay ahead. Each name represented a family destroyed, a potential unrealized, a life lost to institutional failures that once were accepted as inevitable costs of military service.
We remember them not just as victims, Rebecca said during her remarks at the memorial service, but as motivation for the ongoing work of creating institutions that protect rather than harm, that build up rather than tear down, that serve human dignity alongside national security. The international visitors departed the following day with training materials, policy templates, and partnership agreements that would help them implement similar reforms in their own military organizations. The American military's transformation had become a global model for ethical leadership development, but Rebecca understood that each nation would need to adapt the principles to their own cultural contexts and institutional challenges. The ripple effects continued to expand beyond military organizations. The Turner Rodriguez Leadership Institute, established with funding from Congress and private foundations, had trained corporate executives, government officials, educational leaders, and nonprofit administrators in the principles of ethical decision-making under pressure. The Institute's programs had been implemented in Fortune 500 companies, federal agencies, and international organizations seeking to create cultures that rewarded moral courage rather than punishing it. Rebecca's own family had been shaped by the transformation as well. Her daughter, Elena Turner Rodriguez, was now 14 years old and had grown up hearing stories about moral courage and institutional change that most children learned about only in history books. Elena's generation would enter military service, if they chose to, in an environment that their parents had helped create through sacrifice and determination. The Turner family farm in Nebraska had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for military personnel seeking to understand the values that had shaped one of their institution's most transformational leaders. Thomas and Linda Turner, now in their 80s, still welcomed visitors who wanted to understand how a small farming community had produced someone willing to risk everything for principle. "We just taught her to do what was right," Thomas would tell visitors. "The military taught her how to do it effectively." Rebecca's marriage to Alex Rodriguez had endured and strengthened through the challenges and opportunities that her actions had created. Their partnership had become a model for how personal relationships could survive and thrive despite the demands of public service and institutional transformation. Alex had developed his own expertise in logistics and organizational change, supporting the implementation of reforms throughout the military supply system. But the most meaningful validation of the transformation came in the form of letters Rebecca received from service members who had never experienced the kind of toxic leadership that had once been commonplace throughout the military. Young soldiers wrote to thank her for creating conditions that allowed them to serve with dignity and respect. Junior officers described command climates that emphasized development rather than domination. Senior leaders shared stories about the satisfaction of building people up rather than tearing them down. The work continued with new challenges and opportunities. Emerging technologies created new possibilities for both ethical and unethical leadership. Changing demographics required adaptation of training programs and policies to serve increasingly diverse military populations. Global conflicts demanded leaders who could balance humanitarian concerns with tactical necessities. But the fundamental principles established through the Williamson transformation remained constant. Individual moral courage mattered. Institutional systems could be changed. Leaders had obligations to protect those they led. Human dignity was compatible with military effectiveness. Justice was worth fighting for, even when the cost seemed unbearable. As Rebecca prepared for retirement from active duty, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from a struggling farm in Nebraska to the highest levels of military leadership. The frightened captain who had broken a general's wrist to protect a vulnerable soldier had become a four-star general whose legacy would influence military culture for generations. But her greatest pride was reserved not for her own achievements, but for the thousands of service members who now served in an institution that valued their contributions, respected their dignity, and protected them from abuse. The silence had been broken permanently, replaced by a culture that rewarded speaking truth to power, that celebrated moral courage alongside tactical competence, that understood justice as essential rather than optional. The story that had begun with 5 seconds of moral courage had become a testament to the power of individuals to change institutions, principles to triumph over politics, and justice to prevail despite the forces arrayed against it. The legacy would endure as long as people remembered that doing the right thing was always worth whatever it cost, and that protecting others was the highest calling of leadership in any organization, military or civilian.
Standing in the Nebraska sunset that painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and red, Brigadier General Rebecca Turner Rodriguez knew that her parents' lessons about principle and sacrifice had not only guided her through the most difficult moment of her life, but had helped transform an entire institution's understanding of what leadership really meant. The farm that had shaped her character had become the foundation for changes that would protect countless others from the kind of abuse that had once flourished in shadows and silence. The transformation was complete, but the work would never end. Each new generation of leaders would face their own tests of moral courage, their own moments when principle and convenience would conflict, their own opportunities to choose protection over politics and justice over safety. The legacy of the Williamson incident would live on in the systems, cultures, and expectations that had emerged from one woman's refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice. The 5 seconds that changed everything had become a foundation for lasting transformation that would serve generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.